is, do you think you grew up in a racist environment, that your father was inherently racist, and that thought process moved to you?
Well, I would say it's a new low. I've been attacked for being a racist many times, but to attack my father, to attack my parents based on anecdotes, I would say that's sort of a new low.
Hang on, it's your anecdote.
Yeah, but he's not here to defend himself.
You are.
And my parents are.
You told the story.
And I will. And I'll defend them.
I'm not trying to ambush you. As I said at the start, Nick, to be clear.
No, it's not an ambush.
Nick, to be clear,
I think everybody
I'm not
understands.
ambushing you. I'm literally reading an anecdote that you revealed on your podcast.
In today's video, Piers Morgan destroys Nick Fuentes on Piers Morgan Uncensored as the conversation turns into one of the most explosive confrontations ever aired on the show. Piers Morgan doesn't hold back, grilling Nick Fuentes on his openly racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic beliefs and pushing him with hard evidence and real-world data that Nick Fuentes struggles to escape. And when Nick Fuentes tries to reframe his extremism as realism, Piers Morgan counters with sharp fact checks and exposes the contradictions at the core of Fuentes' worldview. So let's dive in and watch how Piers Morgan shuts down Nick Fuentes on Piers Morgan Uncensored.
An American nationalist. I said, I want to preserve my home and the things that are familiar to me and the things I like about my home, what makes it America. So that's a little bit about my background. I don't know where you want to go with that, but that's kind of where I came from.
My first obvious question is, were your parents immigrants to the United States, or were their parents, or were their grandparents? In other words, at some stage, I presume, there were immigrants in your family who came to the US. Is that correct?
There were. I believe my mother was fourth generation and my father was third generation. So their ancestors came here on my mom's side in the 1860s, I believe, the first wave of Italian immigration. My father's ancestors, I think they came around at the turn of the century in 1900.
So your view of immigration, and we'll get to the specifics about your views on immigration, are they not affected at all by the fact that if it wasn't for immigration, you wouldn't exist as an American?
Well, I would certainly exist, but like you said, maybe not as an American. Certainly that's influenced in some measure. But I think that the kind of immigration that we had for a long time in the country, it's different than the immigration that we have now. And let's just say for openers, it's different immigrants. They're coming from a different place with a different culture, a different religion. It's not the same as it was. So first, you have a qualitative difference. My ancestors, for the most part, I have three European grandparents from Ireland and Italy, one from Mexico. They came from Europe. They came from a society where there's a common ancestry, there's a common religion, common civilization. The people that have come in since 65, since Hart-Celler, they're coming from China, India, the Northern Triangle, Mexico, Venezuela. And so first, they're just different people. Secondly, it's a quantitative difference. There's way more, and it's an unceasing, always increasing wave. For the first 3 or 4 waves of immigration, you would have a major influx of immigrants and then it would stop. And then you'd have another wave and then it would stop. This one, it just keeps going up for 35 years and it's too many. So that's really where I would draw the distinction between maybe where I originate from. I would even just simply call that immigration. What this is an invasion. It's a completely different policy.
But you mentioned,
can't even call it the same thing.
But you mentioned Mexico in that list, and your father is half Mexican. So,
yeah,
I mean, by your criteria, part of the invasion would include your father, presumably, and his immediate descendants who came from Mexico.
Not really true, because when my father's ancestors came here, it was a small fraction of the total immigrants that came from Mexico. I don't believe that we should have zero immigrants forever, or even zero immigrants from non-white countries. But you have to draw the distinction. My father's father, he was here in the 40s and 50s. It was his parents, or I believe either his parents or grandparents, that came here even earlier. Up until 1965, 90% of the immigrants were coming from Europe. I have no problem with that. If we have 10% of them coming from Mexico or Latin America, maybe that's reasonable, but that's not what it is now. Now you've got 10 million illegals in 4 years under Joe Biden, and you got millions more legal immigrants. from China, India, Venezuela, El Salvador. And it's so many with no break for assimilation. And they're all from non-white countries. It's transforming what America is. And again, that's the distinction. That's what makes it unacceptable.
I always believe everybody is a product of their environment. Right? I've interviewed thousands of people. Maybe 3, 4, 5,000 people from all different walks of life. But the one common theme I would say is everyone's a product of their environment.
It's hard not to notice how selectively Nick frames immigration. Piers is right to push back because the idea that earlier European immigrants were somehow more compatible with America isn't grounded in history. When Italians and Irish came in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the same waves Nick cites, they were not seen as culturally aligned. Italians were labeled criminals. Catholics were considered a threat, and both groups were accused of not assimilating. Newspapers at the time literally described them with the same panic-filled language Nick uses today. Nick also leans heavily on numbers, but even that doesn't hold. The 10 million illegals in 4 years claim isn't supported by DHS or independent demographers. Estimates show increased encounters at the border, but not anywhere near his stated population change. And the idea that America ever had pauses in immigration ignores the reality. Migration has always been constant. What changed were laws restricting who counted. Piers's point about personal roots matters too. Nick's own family benefited from these same immigration patterns he now condemns. The US has always evolved through diversity, and the evidence consistently shows immigrants, regardless of origin, integrate, work, start businesses, and contribute just as strongly as the Europeans did a century ago.
And I was reading some stuff about you in the last few days. There was an episode of your podcast where you talked about your father, Bill Fuentes, and how he wouldn't take the family, including you, to certain restaurants because he believed they were associated with African Americans. We would be deciding where to go to eat, you said. What are we going to do for dinner tonight? It was a running joke. Me and my sister would say Applebee's, and my dad would say we would never eat at Applebee's. Not in a million years should you be caught dead, Fuentes said about Applebee's. Go to a different restaurant, a local restaurant. No Applebee's, no Red Lobster. That is commonly known as black fare. And you also shared another story about your family and restaurants. Said, before me and my sister were born, my family had a saying about Olive Garden that contains the N-word that we're not allowed to say. So my question, based on that anecdote that you say on your own podcast, is, do you think you grew up in a racist environment, that your father was inherently racist, and that thought process moved to you?
Well, I would say it's a new low. I've been attacked for being a racist many times, but to attack my father, to attack my parents based on anecdotes, I would say that's sort of a new low.
Hang on, it's your anecdote.
Yeah, but he's not here to defend himself.
You are.
And my parents are.
You told the story.
And I will. And I'll defend them.
I'm not trying to ambush you. As I said at the start, Nick, to be clear.
No, it's not an ambush.
Nick, to be clear,
I think everybody
I'm not
understands.
ambushing you. I'm literally reading an anecdote that you revealed on your podcast. It's you that's put it in the public domain.
I know.
I'm simply asking you whether my assessment of that, which is that your father didn't want to take you to certain restaurants because of what you refer to as, they were commonly known as black fare, whether that attitude to African Americans in that instance permeated to you. It's a reasonable question.
Yeah, no, like I said, I think everybody knows what that is, but I'll address it. I'll engage with it, and I'll defend my father from the charge of racism.
Sure.
No, my parents are not racist, and they've never been racist. I'll tell you about my parents. They used to have a school in Chicago in the South Loop where they instructed people on how to shoot firearms. It was a security school, and most of the clients were black. And I believe actually one of their clients was Larry Hoover's son at one point, sort of a funny story. And so most of their clients would come in from the South side of Chicago. My grandmother, she grew up in the projects in the city. And so my family, being in Chicago, being ethnics, being Italian, Irish, Mexican, and the West Side on Taylor Street, all over the city. My family for many generations have lived near and around black people. And look, my views about black people and their views about black people are shaped with experiences with black people. And what they will tell you, what my parents would say if they were here, is that for many, many years, the older generations of Black people were very respectful, very humble, very decent. In fact, my grandma used to have an anecdote. She grew up in a lot of dysfunction. Her mother was mentally ill, and they would be having dinner in the projects, and there'd be so much chaos and dysfunction and disagreement and fighting. And she would look across the way out the window at a Black family in the other apartment, and they'd be holding hands around the table saying grace. And this is sort of the culture that used to prevail. But now what you have in the city is that there's no accountability for the Black people. And now Chicago has become a complete dump because these teenagers go out and they take over the city. They call them teen takeovers. That's the euphemism for it. They're teenagers, but they all come from the same neighborhood. They drive up there and they mug people and attack people, and they destroy cars and destroy shops.
Listening to Nick explain his upbringing, it's clear he wants to frame these stories as harmless family quirks, but that doesn't really address the bigger issue. The environment you grow up in does shape the assumptions you carry into adulthood. That isn't an insult, it's psychology. Studies going back decades show that repeated exposure to racial stereotypes, even in casual settings like choosing restaurants, strongly influences someone's worldview later on. That's why Piers questioning the impact is completely fair. Nick also leans heavily on anecdotal stories about teen takeovers and claims that Chicago's problems stem from a lack of accountability in one specific community. But the data contradicts that. Chicago's overall crime rate has actually been declining over the past several years, and the biggest drivers of crime are economic inequality, lack of investment, and access to firearms, not race. The FBI and DOJ have been extremely clear on that, and the idea that past generations of Black Americans were universally more respectful is a textbook nostalgia myth. Every era romanticizes the one before it. Social issues evolve, but blaming an entire population has never been supported by evidence. In contrast, Piers is grounding the conversation in documented facts, not stereotypes.
We had the Festival of Lights a couple of weeks ago. It's supposed to be a family event, and they light up the trees, and there's a big parade. I was in the parade one year, and you had a bunch of Black people there shooting each other. 7 people shot, a 14-year-old killed in the Magnificent Mile. And I know there's a lot of Black people that feel the same way about this. They say, we've lost control of the city, and we're looking for accountability. We have a lot of Black people that are always outraged about racism, outraged about attitudes from white people, but they're never ashamed of some of these behaviors, never ashamed of some of the things that go on. And that's why I think there's a lot of negative attitudes these days. And so, again, I think those attitudes, you say I'm a product of my environment. I am. And so are my parents and my grandparents. Unlike you, because you're not even American, in Chicago, we have to live in a big, diverse city where there's a lot of different kinds of people. And I think anybody in Chicago will tell you the same.
I live in London. It's one of the biggest and most diverse cities in the world.
But it's not the same.
Well, actually, it's a big, diverse city. The only difference is we don't have the gun violence because we don't have guns. That's a whole different story. I don't want to get into that with you. I have got into that before in America.
You got a knife problem. You got sword problems.
We have problems with
Aladdin.
We have problems with violent crime. I make no pretense of it. So the idea that somehow I'm cosseted in London because I'm not in Chicago.
I didn't say that.
Well, you kind of implied it. But I guess my point about the environment, I'm not saying you are a product of your environment. I'm saying most people are in some capacity. When I read that anecdote, which just to remind you, it's not something I have put out there. You told this story, right? And you said that
you said this. We're looping. You said this already.
But you haven't really directly, I think, responded to it, which is whether your father would not take you to certain restaurant chains because he associated them with Black Americans. Is that true?
No. Well. See here, if you're in America, you would say that Olive Garden is not real Italian food. Applebee's, TGI Fridays, this stuff is a load of crap. My dad was just a food snob, but no, it's got nothing to do with that. My best friend in first grade was a Black guy. We're not a racist family. So
okay, so when you told the story, I'm just curious. So when you told that anecdote, which clearly on the face of it is racist, right? You're basically saying your father made racist decisions about where you would go as a family to eat. Are you saying,
no.
well, I'm just going to ask you a question. Are you saying that when you told that story, you didn't mean to infer that he was racist? And do you understand why when somebody like me reads that anecdote for the first time, as I did this week, I reach a different conclusion?
Well, I understand what you're doing, which is a sort of making of a murderer. How did he become racist? Well, his father didn't eat an Olive Garden because he said that's not real Italian food. Hang on, can I? What's with the interruptions? Can I explain?
I'm literally reminding you of something you said on your show, which led me to conclude a certain thing. If I'm wrong, tell me.
Yeah, it was said in jest as a humorous anecdote, and now you're trying to spin it into a narrative, which is his parents are racist. He comes from a long line of racists. And I think everybody knows my parents are boomers. Mm-hmm. And these people well, you're a boomer, I guess, too, in a way,
60.
right? You were born in what, 19? Yeah. So you're a boomer also. Or maybe you're a Gen Xer. I suppose it's sort of on the cusp. But it's a humorous anecdote. These are kind of the attitudes of baby boomers in society. But you're trying to spin it into a narrative, which is you're a product of your environment. Your dad's racist because of this joke. Now you're a racist. And I don't think that's a fair characterization.
Okay. People can make their own minds up. They can go back and listen to you say it. I mean, the beauty of what I'm going to talk to you about in this interview is that almost all of it is just going to be reminding you what you have said and asking you what you meant. Your position about that story is that it was a joke, okay?
What Nick's doing here is a classic move. He takes isolated incidents, strips away all context, and then uses them to define an entire population. But when you look at actual data, not anecdotes, the narrative collapses. Chicago's crime issues don't stem from one racial group. They're tied to economic inequality, school closures, lack of stable housing, and decades of disinvestment. Even the University of Chicago Crime Lab has said repeatedly that structural conditions predict violence far more than race ever has. And Nick's description of teen takeovers also leaves out something important. A majority of arrests in Chicago for these events have been from mixed groups, not exclusively black teens. The police department's own reports show that. His framing makes it sound like a cultural flaw rather than what it actually is. Youths acting out in environments with limited resources and opportunity. Then there's the idea that Piers somehow can't speak on urban violence because he lives in London. That just doesn't hold up. London is one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world, and research shows diverse cities actually develop lower levels of race-based bias due to constant exposure and social mixing. Diversity doesn't create violence, inequality does. And when Nick tries to reframe his own racist anecdotes as harmless humor, that doesn't erase their implications. You can call something a joke, but if it reflects the worldview you argue publicly, people are right to question it. Piers is simply grounding the conversation in reality, and that's why his stance holds up. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing, and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out Ground News in the description down below.